I think Danny's gonna go crazy too. By the way, I know people hated that in the show. I think she's gonna go crazy. I think that's something they got
I'd
from
love to hear
George.
your reasoning on that. I tend to disagree personally.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Serialized. I'm your host, Kino, and I'm joined by a content creator who I am a big fan of. He is a Song of Ice and Fire creator who I watch a ton of, Quinn the GM. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm really glad to hear you're such a big fan of the series. I'm excited to chat about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a huge Song of Ice and Fire fan, been for a long time. Before we start talking about the series, though, I'd love to just give you a chance to intro yourself to the audience, tell them a little bit about what you do here on YouTube.
Sure, I'm Quinn the GM. Hello. GM stands for not General Motors or anything else. It's Game Master. I started out talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and then during, I think it was the first season of House of the Dragon, I started talking about my favorite book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, and that started doing better than anything I'd made before, so now that's what I do. I do all kinds of videos, often analyzing the text as it currently stands and speculating about the future of the series, should there be a future to the series. But yeah, it's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, like I said, I'm a big fan of your channel. People ask me, they're like, "Oh, are you ever going to do any Game of Thrones content?" And I always kind of respond to them that I don't feel like there's a need to. I feel like there's such good channels here on YouTube that cover all about the series. Your channel, of course, you've got guys like Alt Shift X. There's a lot of great channels out there that really cover the stuff in depth, and I'm a big fan of it. And I like watching and listening to it. Since you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan, have you ever done any a Song of Ice and Fire like role play games? Because I know they have one of those, right?
I've looked into it. I did a D&D, A Song of Ice and Fire one-shot once using like 5e, but like not any like spellcasting systems within it. I've looked into the role-playing game that exists for Ice and Fire. I've heard a variety of like first-hand impressions of it. I do want to do like a one-shot of it at some point, but I've yet to get around to that.
That would be fun someday. But yeah, I mean, talking about the book series, which are obviously both big fans of, how did you first get into A Song of Ice and Fire?
I'm sure it's very similar to a lot of other people. I was in I think ninth grade at the time. Season 6 of the show was airing, and a bunch of my friends were interested in it. The memory that stands out to me is I remember people in whatever math class I was taking at the time talking about The Door, which had just aired, and I thought it sounded like a really interesting concept. So I watched like the rest of season 6, and then I went back and read the books, and then I went back and watched the show. And then I sort of rediscovered it again in college, and then end of college I started making videos like this, which I didn't expect to do, but I've really enjoyed. How did you get started with it?
Kind of same as you. I think I started watching. Second season was out. Third season was not out. So I just people recommended it. I think I'd seen it once on HBO, like at a hotel room, because you know how in hotels they sometimes have HBO. We didn't have HBO at the time, but I remember seeing like a scene of someone having sex or something. I was like, "Ooh, what's this?" But I didn't know what it was for a long time, and then I found out it was Game of Thrones. Went back, watched it, loved it, became obsessed with it. But like I said, only season 2 is out, and season 3 wasn't out yet. And I was like, well, I can't wait to for the new season to come out, so I'm just going to start reading the books then instead. And I fell in love with it. I am a big fan of the television series. I think it does a lot of great things. But man, the books, I mean, it's true of like almost any media. The books are just so much better. Like they're so rich. There's so much characterization there. George R. R. Martin has become one of, if not my favorite authors of all time. I think that more so than just like what's on the surface of like, oh, dragons and the War of the Five Kings and all the surface like fantasy stuff. There's so much depth to these characters, to the themes that it presents, where it's like you'll read the book through one time, get one impression, read it again, and you'll get a completely different impression of the characters because you're just so good at like layering meaning to this stuff. That's why I fell in love with the series.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting to especially compare television show to books, because I think the television show does a good job, especially early on, kind of conveying the broader like story and plot that Martin is so intricately crafted here. But all of these elements of like thematics and, like you said, characterization, I do think is the biggest thing that you kind of lose out on without getting into the books themselves. Because I think what Martin does best is getting us into the heads of each of these characters. Because like as it grows and continues, and we've got what, like 20 viewpoints going into the Winds of Winter now, and you can so clearly tell like who's who just from being in their head, the way they think about the world, about themselves, and it's so fun to see and interact with, and have just this kind of broader world that everybody is, playing a part in.
Yeah, and I think that again, like you said, the show was very strong early on, kind of following the material, but as it kind of got distance and had to kind of create its own original material because it surpassed the books where they are. I think that's where you lost it, and the way that George again writes these complex characters, and not just complex in the sense that like, oh, this guy kills people and he's like immorally gray. That's the word people throw around a lot. I actually think that some of the characters are not quite as morally gray as the audience makes them out to be. But the ones that are really complex, it's not just that they do good things and bad things, but it's that their actions can be read in like heroic ways or in awful ways too. Like Tyrion's a great example where he's a very likable character, very enjoyable. But when you objectively look at what he does throughout most of the series, Alt Shift X has a great video about that, the real Tyrion. It's like, man, this guy is evil. He does a lot of horrible stuff, but I still really like him because, again, when we get into the head, like you said, we really start to understand who they are. And no one thinks they're a bad guy. They always think what they're doing is justified. But yeah, this person's awful.
Yeah, and it definitely, as the series progresses as well, you get not only characters like Tyrion kind of having these arcs where they're going to darker places, and oftentimes in this kind of more complex moral realm, you start to get actual kind of villains being introduced as viewpoint characters, like getting to see like Cersei in A Feast for Crows, her world through her eyes is just so fun because she has been this antagonistic presence for the three books previous, and then we're like looking at just kind of how she's seeing things and what the world looks like in that light. And it's just her arc in Feast is one of my favorites ever. And you're right that it is not always as morally gray as people kind of make it out to be. I often cite like, oh, people like Davos or Brienne or all of these, some of these children. Arya, kills a lot of people. But regardless, there are very much moral extremes in Ice and Fire in a way that I think often isn't communicated, because I think the show was this more morally gray for everybody situation, or at least that's how the showrunner seemed to want to portray it. But I think it is interesting to see kind of these pillars of good, like Davos and Brienne, kind of come up against a world that is realistic in the way it kind of opposes that and makes it not that good is necessarily like futile or anything, but it is to be good and to make those choices is the harder route often. I think Martin portrays that really well.
And not always the right choice too. I always talk about Robb Stark's arc in the books where he's presented in this very heroic light. He's the young king. He's trying to avenge his father. He's doing the honorable thing, right? In the books, he marries a girl because he gets her pregnant. He does the right thing you're supposed to do, which is stand by the girl. But it's stupid. It's so incredibly stupid. And he gets so many people killed by following the honorable path. You can say the same thing about someone like Ned Stark. Very honorable man makes the wrong choices that result in more deaths than if he had done the less honorable thing. And I love that how George plays with those heroic fantasy tropes where it's like, no, doing the moral thing is not always the right thing. Like there's times where you got to be pragmatic, or there's going to result in way more suffering than if you had just kind of kept your own personal honor there. So again, I love how a lot of people say Song of Ice and Fire is a deconstruction of the fantasy genre. I don't think it's a full on like critique and him taking down. I think he embraces a lot of the tropes of the genre. And I think we do have characters who will be on heroic, character arc journeys like Daenerys or Jon. Will they be more complicated than the standard, fantasy? I think so. But I think he is setting up there will be a heroic type ending to this series.
Yeah, that's part of the tricky thing, because we've been frozen in like the lowest point of so many of these characters'
We've been
stories
frozen in winter for 20
Correct.
years.
Winter has exactly arrived as of the epilogue of A Dance with Dragons, when we've been there for 15 years. But yeah, it's interesting to see all of that and see the like elements of this idea of being honorable way to actually being good. And I think that the story of Jaime especially is one that very much focuses on that, and especially in relation to Ned Stark, it kind of adds this interesting dimension of like him sitting on the throne and Ned Stark judging him guilty for having killed Aerys without hearing any of Jamie's side of it, kind of tying in this idea of honor with the idea that it could be kind of tied in with judgment as well in this medieval system. Looking at the series more broadly, do you have a particularly favorite book out of it? Do you have one
I
that
was
stands
just gonna
out?
bring this up to you because you said you love the Feast for Crows arc. I love Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons. I know those are the two least popular books, but man, I think this is where George's writing is the strongest in the entire series. A lot of people don't like those books because the plot is slower, it's not really advancing the story as much, but not only does the character writing is just so incredible and so rich. I think again, what George is so great at is this sleight of hand he does with his writing, where he'll set up something and you think like, oh, what's the point of this? It's kind of just like a tangent here, but no, this is going to be a really big thing later on, and it's not presented that way. It's not drawing attention to it, like, hey, pay attention to what's going on with the Ironborn here or the Dornish here, but we are really setting up what's going to be, the final conflict if, of course, he ever gets around to actually finishing it. But um, I think Feast for Crows and Dance for Dragons, which are really one book together, are is my favorite arc of the series. There's stuff like Storm of Swords, which is a very exciting book, very plot heavy. But I think sometimes, when I've gone back and read it, it moves so fast through the plot. It's so exciting that you don't get as much time to sit with these characters and really kind of give them a chance to breathe as much as the later books do.
I wholeheartedly agree with pretty much all of that. A Storm of Swords, especially, I think is a book that is probably broadly the favorite in the series, at least among just like fans generally, because it's so action packed and it has so much just iconic material in it. But I also think there are elements of it that are on the weaker side. I think characterization is maybe one of them because there just isn't enough time to sit with anybody, and also pacing, as you mentioned. I think that like having things packed so closely together, like in the show, the Red Wedding and the Purple Wedding are only 4 episodes apart, but there's a season break in between, so it feels like there's a substantial shift. And in the book, it's just like a matter of several chapters, and there are these two massive shifts to the status quo, and we don't always get to follow up on the full results of that just then. And that's part of what I love so much about A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, because it does very much sit in those consequences and what all of these previous books have meant not only to the characters themselves, but to the wider world. I think if taken together, Feast and Dance are probably my favorite. If like having to separate them, I would say Dance is probably my favorite. I think elements of Feast are a little on the weaker side for me. I think that's mostly a product of its production being like kind of half a book and Martin kind of putting together what he had completed and shipping it. So I think certain arcs don't super fit in or don't super feel like they're fully baked. So there's this idea of like, oh, Martin intended to do a 5 year gap at one point in the series. So certain characters are just like left to kind of, cook for a while. And you feel like Sansa and Arya are just kind of in this stage of development where they're like not really progressing all that much and they don't have that much material. But I do think arcs like Jamie, Cersei, Brienne are just incredible.
The 5 year gap, I really think George made a mistake by not following through with that. I think I read his reasoning of why he didn't do it. I understand certain arcs wouldn't have worked, but looking back, I think he needed those characters to be in a certain spot and needed us 5 years. And I think one of the struggles he's had with Wins is that the characters are just not ready to be where they need to be for the final plot points, and he's had to kind of rush to make them happen. And I think he's dealing with that here. Where looking back, I wonder if maybe Feast for Crows should have been like a time lapse book where we jump around throughout the 5 years, which I don't think would have been that weird. Like I
No.
think in real history, like things take a lot of time. Like wars take like decades in the Middle Ages. So I think it would have been fine to have like a break where it's like, yeah, a couple of years are going to pass between certain chapters, and that's totally fine. But like I said, there's great material in Dance about Danny and John learning to be rulers. But I do think to myself like afterwards, like you know how the final seasons of Game of Thrones, everyone complained how rushed they were about like, oh, okay, I guess we're in the north. Oh, I guess we're back south again. I guess we're over here. I think George is going to have to do something similar in the books to just realistically deal with the all the battles and getting everyone where they need to be and meeting the people they need to meet. I don't think he can realistically do it in 2 books. I think it's got to be a minimum 3, but Man, that's a big order to ask of the man.
I do think the biggest enemy of Martin's progress for this past decade and a half has been his 2 book limit that he is pretty strictly stuck to. So I do think you're absolutely right that with wins, there is just so much that is going to need to happen and be packed in so tightly when that's kind of the opposite to the direction the series has taken so far. Like A Storm of Swords is very tightly packed and tightly plotted, but the 2 more recent books since then have been much more expansive and kind of taking their time and actually fleshing things out. And at points, it doesn't even feel like we're ready to get to those climaxes yet. At certain points, it does seem like a 5 year gap probably was necessary. It feels weird that we're going into like the end of the series and Bran's going to be 10, Arya's going to be 12, John and Danny are 2 like main protagonists are going to be like 16 or 17 going into it. It's kind of strange. And I do agree that Feast probably should have remained what Martin originally intended it to be, which was it was supposed to be the 5 year gap book. It was supposed to be those plots that needed to kind of have material in that interim. And I think that could have been done. It probably would have needed to focus on slightly different characters. I think Cersei, obviously, the 2 characters that Martin's always cited as killing the 5 year gap have been Jon and Cersei, which makes sense because they both come into this like position of power, with Cersei now being the regent and Jon now being the Lord Commander. But if you focused on like those 2 spheres, sort of a book in the north and a book in the south, it could be quite interesting and it could allow other plots to kind of develop further. And I do think you could like throw in another chapter to like look in on a character as they're trading. Like we could get like a chapter of Arya at the House of Black and White. And that could be an interesting way to have gone about it. But also that I'm not sure that that would 110% work. And there are other elements of the story that seem like Martin has kind of progressed them 5 years in just like less time. Like Theon being so fully Reek and having his hair like completely white and being entirely different, to me always felt like it should have been longer than the like I think around a year that he would have been in captivity.
I think so too. And I think you could look at other stuff like Arya's the little glimpses we've gotten into her arc in Winds of Winter. It kind of feels like she's been training much longer than she has. And I think the show dealt with that too. Like not literally just the fact that the actors aged, but it felt like they got older than they were supposed to be by this point. I mean, they just had to, for the story's sake. So I think George will find himself forced to kind of Arya will still be, 12 or whatever, but she'll feel like she's like, 16 or something by this point, just because she'll kind of need to be to fulfill her arc.
Do you know the fun little bit of trivia about that Arya Winds of Winter chapter?
No, what's the trivia?
So Mercy, Arya's only chapter in the Winds of Winter, was written in 2002. It was supposed to be her first chapter after the 5 year gap. So the reason it feels like that is because that's what it is.
That completely makes sense to me. And yeah, like I said, that probably goes to show he probably should have jumped in, and maybe he could do it in the Winds of Winter. Maybe he could wrap up the Battle of Blood and the battle in the ice, and maybe we jump ahead a little bit. Maybe not full 5 years, but maybe some time has passed. Who knows if when and if we ever get that book? But yeah, I think there's a lot of issues with George dealing with in the writing here. I Preston Jacobs had a great video where he talked also about the fact that George has a hard time writing like multiple POVs together at the same point. Like the example he cited, it was like, was Jamie present at the trial of Tyrion? If you ask a lot of fans that, they kind of probably won't know because he was there in the books, I think. But he doesn't really do a whole lot, and it gets hazy with the show about like, wait, was he actually there? Was he not? Did he show up after the trial? What happened there? And he's got to bring all these POVs back together, and that's got to be a very, very hard thing to do because there's so many of them by this point in the series.
It really is. And it is also kind of complicated. Another great Preston Jacobs video that I'm recalling on this topic is that Martin's typical crutches in terms of getting around these issues that he has are to write additional material and invent viewpoint characters. And he is no longer able to do either of those because he's stuck with these 2 books he wants to finish. And he said he's not going to add any more viewpoint characters, which, like, he has said that in the series past and still added viewpoint characters. But at this point in the story, I don't think that would really work because we already have probably too many to begin with. Because it's worth noting that like A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons are 2 books, but the same book. But now all of these viewpoint characters are coming back together. And the only ones that have died off in those 2 books are Quentin and John, who's going to come back, but I tend to think isn't going to come back as a viewpoint.
That would be interesting, not having John as a viewpoint. And that's the other thing too. John's, resurrection That's one of the criticisms of the show is the fact that John really wasn't changed by death when we know, that dying and coming back like changes a person fundamentally. And that's something people have always wrestled with too, is like, what is John going to be like when he comes back? The books, he's a much more complicated character than he is in the show. He's much more of a hero in the show. John in the book is kind of this loner, willing to do, some bad stuff to achieve the peace that he so desperately wants. But yeah, him not being a POV character would be very interesting, and that would be a big change of the series because he's obviously one of the linchpins, him, Tyrion, and Danny of the series. I think Danny's gonna go crazy too. By the way, I know people hated that in the show. I think she's gonna go crazy. I think that's something they got
I'd
from
love to hear
George.
your reasoning on that. I tend to disagree personally.
Okay, so the couple of things. George, I talked about this before. George has this thing where he sets up an expectation for a character and then subverts it. Right? Rob Stark's a great one. A hero, young king, does awful, like stupid stuff, gets everyone killed, and dies. He does this where he flips a lot of these heroic characters on their heads, or villainous characters like Jamie, and flips them on their heads too. Danny is the person most set up to be the hero of the universe. Like, we as readers feel like John, but in universe, everyone thinks Danny's the savior, right? She's Azor Ahai to a lot of people. She's the mother who saved all these people. She's going to, come back to Westeros, reclaim her destiny, reunite the Seven Kingdoms again. I think that he's going to subvert that by having her go do the Targaryen madness thing, because he set up this whole thing where the Targaryens are like, every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. One of them goes crazy, one of them goes sane. He sets up Viserys as the crazy one. That's his storyline in book one. However, in book five, Dany kind of reflects more on her brother and realizes that, he wasn't as crazy asshole as I first thought he was. He endured a lot of suffering to protect the two of us. And yeah, he was treated her badly too, but she has a vision of her brother in when she's wandering the Dothraki Sea. I think we're gonna subvert it and be like, oh wait, Danny's actually the one who's going to go crazy. And I think that is, I don't think it'll be as like abrupt as it was in the show, but I think all the whole thing about Quaithe telling her to remember who she is, and Dario telling her to, embrace fire and blood. There's all these hints that she's going to become a more ruthless leader, the fire of the series, compared to John, who's like the ice of the series. So I think some sort of arc where she becomes a more ruthless, bloodthirsty character is in the works for her.
I think you're right that there is a subversion upcoming for Daenerys, and I do think you're right that she is going to end up being a bit more ruthless as a character. But I think that subversion might be slightly in a different area. She is beloved by her people right now, but her people are not the people she is going to rule in Westeros. I think the big idea with Daenerys is this idea of home and what home is. That's what she always wanted as a child and what she never knew. And she always thought of Westeros as that home because of Viserys, because of her brother. And I think the issue is going to be Daenerys coming west and finding that it isn't her home. She doesn't know it. The people don't know her. They see her as this foreign conqueror with dragons. The way they would have feared Aegon the Conqueror, they'll fear her. And I think there might be this perception of her as this mad monarch, and I don't think that perception will necessarily reflect reality. I think that if we are going to get a Targaryen going mad in the future of the books, I think Aegon is maybe a little bit more set up for that, especially with having grayscale in his camp. And I think that, especially if he contracts it, he might end up going crazy. And I do think there's an excellent point talking about Daenerys and that final chapter in the Dothraki Sea and re-embracing fire and blood, her Targaryen words and destiny. I think that more has to do with her arc in A Dance with Dragons than it does her necessarily going mad. Because if you look at Ark and A Dance with Dragons, a lot of people hate it. It's a lot of people's least favorite in the entire series because it is very slow and introspective, and it is Daenerys not doing great at being a leader. But this entire time, she's learning and growing and developing. And I think that lesson she learns in the Dothraki Sea isn't that fire and blood is the only solution to all of her problems. It is that it is a solution that she can use. Because I think in A Dance with Dragons, she's giving so much grace to all of these people who really don't deserve it, all of these people who are kind of carving her out, trying to undermine her at any given point. she is trying to preserve things just for the sake of preserving them and not being seen as this dictator. And I think that she is going to be a bit more true to the Targaryen ideal of embracing power that is fire and blood, in my opinion, at least.
No, I agree with you, and I think I misspoke a little bit when I said she's gonna go mad. I use that kind of as a shorthand for she's gonna become more bloodthirsty. I actually don't think any of the Targaryens besides Aerys were actually like insane. Or there might be some of the side character, like the little offhanded mentions from Fire and Blood of who's actually
Aerion is
insane.
also probably up there, not to give Duncan Egg spoilers.
Yeah, but I think a lot of like Maegor and stuff, I don't think he was actually insane. I think he was just like cruel and psychopathic, which is not the same thing. I think when people talk about Targaryen insanity, they're like, oh, they're literally crazy. And that's why, no, I think they're just ruthless leaders who are willing to do whatever they have to do to maintain their power. And I think that's more so what I meant with Dany is I think she will become a more bloodthirsty, a more ruthless person, willing to not just treat people nice like she's been doing in A Dance with Dragons, but like, yeah, if you piss me off, I'm gonna burn you to death alive. And I think people might interpret that as her madness, but I think she will have a more villain, for lack of a better word, a more villainous story in the later books than she has been so far.
And I think a lot of that will be due not necessarily to her trajectory, but her trajectory being warped by someone around her. Because I think Tyrion getting to Daenerys and being who he is in A Dance with Dragons is going to kind of spell a darker path for her. And I do think that like him being the only person in Marine who knows about Aegon and John Connington and the fact that they've gone west to reclaim Westeros already and they've already gotten it, I think that will end up shaping Daenerys' perception of him and cause this kind of Targaryen civil war. And I do think you have a great point about Targaryen madness. Actually, I should do a video about that. That would be a good topic to examine. Because with Maegor, I do think like in the later part of his reign, there are elements that kind of dance on that line, but also he's also like a product of blood magic at that point, because like after his trial of seven, he's kind of like semi-resurrected by his mom and one of his wives, and he gets really weird and kind of zombie-like after that. But that'd be fun to examine.
Yeah, and I think also too, I've said this before. I think a lot of people in this series you could look at as mad in a certain way, but you could also look at them as like they just have beliefs that they are willing to go to extremes for. Talking about the whole magic and prophecy side of it, I know there's some people who really think there is no larger prophecy or larger, like Preston Jacobs is one of those guys where it's like, oh yeah, the Azor Ahai thing's all bullshit. It's not going to happen. It's all just make believe stuff. I don't know if I fully embrace that. I think George is breaking down some of the fantasy tropes of like the chosen one. Like the chosen one's not going to be this like heroic Jon Snow from the show type character, but I do think there is some sort of like hand of fate moving people along, not in a clean fantasy type way, but I think prophecy is a part of this. I don't think it'll necessarily work out the way people think it does. Like it's not going to be all rainbows and sunshines. But I do think Azor Ahai is a thing that will happen. Where do you fall on the whole? Is prophecy real or not?
So it's interesting. Prophecy in general in Ice and Fire, I think, is unquestionably real because of sheerly the number of people who have visions about specifically the Red Wedding before it happens. Like Daenerys sees the Red Wedding, Patchface sees the Red Wedding, the Ghost of Highheart sees the Red Wedding. The prophecy, people can see the future, people can glimpse it. Azor Ahai, I view a bit more kind of complexly. I don't necessarily think there's going to be a chosen one. I think that the function of Azor Ahai in the story is as a story. It's a set of these characteristics and traits that many people might share and might not necessarily dictate one chosen one, but shows like the elements that, at least in universe, can be kind of cited to show that someone is divinely favored and is someone who is going to save the world from everything. I do think that there is some element of it that is probably prophetic on some level, given the fact that there is seemingly more prophecy at play in the series than even we know about, given the fact that we now know that the House of the Dragon dagger prophecy came from George Martin, Aegon's Song of Ice and Fire and everything. That makes it seem as though there is more prophetic importance, at least on Azor Ahai, than the series might lead you to believe. Because I mean, at this point, Azor Ahai's main kind of showing in the story is Melisandre thinking Stannis is Azor Ahai, and she's pretty obviously not correct about that. But it is interesting to see kind of the various perceptions, and I could see it having somewhat of an element to do with the ending of everything overall. Like if there is, obviously we know in terms of notes from Martin of the future of the story, King Bran was supposedly one of those notes, and if there is some element of the Tyrion terrible who has a better story element, I think that there could be some element of prophecy playing in there as well.
I think so too. Like I said, I think that George isn't out to completely, destroy all the tropes of fantasy. I also, some people bring up, like, is the setting sci-fi? Is it going to be revealed at the end of the series that the whole thing was aliens, or Westeros is on one of his thousand worlds? Because he's had other, Preston Jacobs had a great series examining all the Thousand Worlds books, but is it? He's used the trope of like worlds with irregular seasons and summer snows and all the stuff that we've seen in Song of Ice and Fire. He's sort of used elements in other stories he's done. I don't think that's him saying this takes place in the Thousand Worlds. He's explicitly said it's not, although some people don't believe him. They think he's like, again, lying or something. But I don't think it's going to be like, oh, it was a nuclear apocalypse that sent everyone back to the Middle Ages, and that's why there are dragons. They're just radioactive creatures. I think. Do I think it's possible that maybe at one point he had that in his head? Maybe. I think though that even if he maybe thought I might subvert it and make it sci-fi at the end, I think the series is so popular now that if he did that, if he did the whole "it was aliens all along" ending, people would hate it, and I think he knows that. I don't think he would do that.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I also think that in like people thinking that, oh, this is something that could be confirmed by the end of the series, I think the nature of the way the series is written kind of prevents that, because for it to be confirmed, it needs to be confirmed to a viewpoint character in the series, and I don't think any viewpoint is going to make some earth-shattering discovery of all of this.
The only one who could maybe do is like Bran, doing the
Yeah.
Weirwood visions or something. Maybe he sees like, oh, a spaceship and he doesn't know what it is or something. But I don't think I don't think that's the direction George is going to go. I mean, people cite the fact that like one of the gods in the House of Black and White is Bacalon the Pale Child, which is a
Hmm.
god from one of his sci-fi stories. And George has said that was just a cheeky little.
I was gonna say, I think he's just having fun.
Yeah, and people are like, no, 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 it means this takes place. And I think you guys got to understand that writers like to put little Easter eggs and stuff in their work. They like to reuse names. A.V. Barris, he's used the name Barristan before. He's used the name Lyanna before. I think he's just, again, doing little references and little homages to his past work. I don't think that is the direction the series will go, that there's some sort of sci-fi or realistic explanation to all of this. I think for this series in particular, he's leaned more into the fact that like magic is cool and mysterious and we don't really understand it. There's not some deeper like sci-fi explanation for why everything is the way it is.
I do also especially think that like Bran is one of the characters that I think is going to get fewer chapters as the series goes on. I'm pretty confident he'll have the last chapter in the entire series, as he was the first chapter in the entire series, but as he is kind of growing more magical and at risk of getting too much information at points, I think Martin will kind of pull back on that. And he has also said many times that Bran is the character that he has the most trouble writing for, and I do think that'll manifest in having fewer chapters, as the opposite has resulted in Tyrion having way too many chapters at various points.
Yeah, I mean that tracks with the show too, where he's written out for the first character who's
Yeah.
really written out for a time, because they never wanted to let the actors go because they were scared they wouldn't come back or something, but they wrote him off for a season because he has literally nothing to do and has way too much like power and viewpoint to he would just discover everything way too quick.
I was just going to say, my pet peeve with that specifically is not only did they write him off for a season, he seemingly does nothing for that entire season. Like, we rejoin him in season 6, and he's just beginning his training. It's annoying. Continue. What were you saying?
That's that arc he has where he's training with Bloodraven, and they never even explain who Bloodraven is. I, as a book reader, knew all that, but I was like, I felt bad for my friends because we would watch the show together, and I was like, "Do you guys have any idea who that guy was?" And they're like, "No." And I was like,
It's Tree Guy.
I get it as a book reader. I know all the stuff, and I understand what they were setting up with him, but like they did not do a good job explaining Bloodraven at all in the show. They didn't explain the Children of the Forest very well. They didn't explain any of this. I mean, that's really the main problem with the later seasons is they're just like, yeah, White Walkers. Oh, and now they're dead. Okay, let's move on. Let's wrap up this
Yeah.
plotline. Move on.
Also, giving the Children of the Forest hand grenades, I don't super love as an artistic choice.
Where do you land on the? They did do one thing interesting with the Children of the Forest, which is that the White Walkers were created by the Children of the Forest.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't really seem to be hinted at in the books at all. Like, I mean, also we got to acknowledge the difference between the White Walkers in the books as opposed to just the whites in the show and in the books, where it's like they're all just zombies in the show, whereas there's a distinct difference between the White Walkers and their undead armies that they control. But I did find that idea fascinating that the children maybe created at least part of the White Walker. Like the White Walker, the spirity White Walkers seem to be their own thing, but maybe the corpse thing was something that Children of the Forest did. What are your thoughts on just like the White Walker mystery? Because that's the big thing that's, we've barely gotten any information about the entire series, yet it's implied to be the most important conflict in the series. So what are your thoughts on where that all lands?
It's something I've never really discussed in a video before, mostly because there is so little information on them in the books. I think they appear in like 5 total chapters. I think whites appear in a few more chapters than that. White Walkers, the others, as they're called in the books, I think it might be like 4 chapters. It's like the prologue of A Game of Thrones, Sam 1, A Storm of Swords, the prologue of A Dance with Dragons, and then, or no, none of the prologue of A Dance with Dragons. It might just be 2 chapters. I think there's more than that. I must be forgetting something.
There's a couple. I know because Sam kills one of them.
Yes, yes. So Sam, that might also be in Sam 1, actually.
Does he do it in Sam? Oh wow.
I think I could be completely wrong. It might be 2 Sam chapters they appear in.
But it's very few appearances. They just,
Yeah.
we see the zombies more, but we only get glimpses of the others.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they are implied to be like more advanced than the show saw them. There are like hints that they have language because in that first prologue, it seems like they're like talking to each other and laughing at Sir Royce. I think it is interesting. I think there are elements of it. I think that it does fit Martin's overall kind of style to have this be some sort of weapon or something created by humanity or some like humanoid species that kind of went haywire, kind of the other half of the dragons being weapons of mass destruction analogy. Given the fact that I think dragons were probably also man-made, at least in terms of like the blood mages of Valyria, maybe like fused them with something else that caused them to be as they are. In the past, I've discussed like the 3 heads of the dragon being this like almost alchemical formula, meaning that like those blood mages fused a wyvern from Zathorios with these fire worms from Valyria and a human, and that's what made a dragon. But the White Walkers, we don't know pretty much anything, and I do think that is one of the biggest problems going into the Winds of Winter because like that does need to be the main final conflict, and it has not been established that super well. I think it is something the show did a maybe better job at establishing, even if they did an absolutely terrible job of following up on it. Mostly because I mean, in like I don't know if you saw a couple years ago this like old almost outline of A Dance with Dragons came out that Martin had worked on. Had you seen that?
No, I haven't seen that one.
There were a bunch of changes in it, and one of the big ones was that John's story, there were a few notes, but the big one was end at Hardhome. So it seems like Hardhome in that episode from the show, not necessarily all of that episode, but the end sequence of that episode was intended to be a part of John's story in A Dance with Dragons. And I do kind of wish it was, because while I love John's arc in Dance, not the fact that John hasn't seen an other yet in the series is insane to me. And I do think that it could have been interesting to kind of explore that, and I don't really know how we'll see it. I've seen some people theorize that like Davos might end up at Hardhome since he's going to Skagos. But yeah, others are maybe one of my biggest question marks in the series, and I would need to look into.
The only thing that I know or that I believe of the other storyline so far is that it's not going to end in a war. Like, or there might be a war, but it's not going to end like this thing. I mean, especially not going to end with Arya killing the Night King, but I don't even think it's going to be like Jon killing the Night King or anything like that. I mean, there is no Night King in the books, but I mean, there's a historic Night King, but there's no central other villain yet that we know of. I just think that George is setting up again this subversion he's going to do, where it's like the characters are preparing for war. That's what John's storyline is in A Dance with Dragons. He's preparing for a war against the others, but I think it's going to end differently or end with diplomacy. There's a line in a dance where someone asks like, "Oh, will you offer the others hospitality?" He's being sarcastic, but I think that is again something George is setting up. The whole name, calling them the others, implies like conjures up the thing of like the psychological concept of the other, the alien. They're distinctly not human, so we hate them. And I think George is trying to subvert that and be like, no, they're not evil ice monsters. They're sentient creatures who maybe we've had dealings with in the past, maybe we haven't, but we have to kind of work. We have to find a solution to work together rather than just killing each other. Because that's not something George believes in, just wars of extermination. So I think I think he's going to subvert that war the war for the dawn that he's setting up.
Wholeheartedly agree. I do think we'll see like some conflict for the Dawn, but I don't think war is the solution, and it's not going to be the end point. And to your point further, I think not only is it like speculated that there must be some sort of deal between others and humanity at some point in the series past, we know of at least one deal in the series past, that being Craster's arrangement with the others to provide his sons. It
Or the
shows that
Black
there
Gate
is
in the
exactly.
castle. Yep.
Yeah, so it shows that there is some kind of higher element there, and I'm really interested to see what that solution is going to be, because I don't think it'll be something that is so easy. I don't think it'll just be like, oh, well, we'll handshake and we'll be cool from here on in. I think it's gonna be something that's gonna have to be like offered and given up, that I think will be
Well, a
interesting.
sacrifice, that's a
Yes.
whole thing that's been set up with Azor High, with John, with all this stuff, is that like it's going to come at a very personal cost to a lot of these characters, and what exactly that's going to take out, whether John's going to kill Danny or something like that. I don't know if that's the way it's going to shake out, but no doubt it's going to be some personal cost to all of this.
Yeah, I tend to think if John truly does fulfill like the Azor High thing, which I go back and forth on, I tend to think that if he's going to sacrifice someone for the Dawn, it kind of makes more sense for his story to be Arya, because she is this presence for him that is kind of just the main person he liked growing up with, someone who was so important to him for so long and who shapes his thoughts even in dance with all these thoughts of fake Arya and whatnot. But yeah, no, I think it'll be interesting to see exactly how things shake out with the others.
What is your least favorite thing about the series? What stuff you don't like about it?
I wish there were more books.
Besides
Beyond
that.
that, I think that there are some weaknesses to the viewpoint structure. I think that it yields some things that end up not being, the greatest. There are chapters that are bad throughout. Other things that I dislike about the series, that's a good question. There are points where the prose isn't the greatest. I think that the series has developed in a way that makes it pretty much impossible for Martin to finish it in a way that he is satisfied with. I wouldn't change the way the series is developed for the world. I love A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, and those are the fruits of that development. And I think that it's great, but I do think it has yielded something that is unwieldy. I also think that the story itself, I'm very grateful for Game of Thrones and for it introducing me and so many other people to this world. I tend to think the series is pretty much unadaptable, at least the main series books, just because of how crucial being in the characters' heads is, and how that's kind of impossible to translate to screen without like a super focused like lens. There are very few shows where I would call someone a viewpoint character. I think Sopranos is probably one of those. I think Tony's perspective is very well established, and I love the use of dreams. It's very Martin to me. But yeah, what about you? What do you think?
I think some of the characters in the books, like I always said it before, I think people overemphasize like, oh, all of George's characters are morally great. No, there's some characters who are like almost cartoonishly simple. Guys like
Yes,
Ramsay Bolton or even Roose to an extent. Like, I hate Roose from the books. I hate the fact that he's like
really.
a vampire. I don't hate his character. I
Mm.
hate he's like a weird, creepy vampire guy. I like the show Roose more. I like that he's just like a normal looking dude who's just capable of like incredibly sociopathic evil. Because it's more realistic that Rob would let this guy anywhere near him. Like Roose from the books is a creepy vampire lord weirdo.
Obsessed with leeches.
Obsessed with I was like, why make him a leech lord? You're gonna make this guy do all this evil stuff. It's so obvious he's gonna do all this evil stuff. Like, why make him look like this? It's like I said, almost cartoonishly simple in this case. So again, I think some of those characters people overemphasize how morally gray or they or subversive they all are. I mean, there's other stuff too. Like I said, I think I had a whole a YouTube video where I talked about a few things the show did better. I
Mm,
think Tyrion's arc in season 4, like the trial arc, I think it actually works better the way the show paces the events. Like
I agree.
I like the fact that he doesn't have a champion when he demands a trial by it's like he's so angry he's not even thinking, he's just like, I demand a trial by and then he afterwards he's got to try to figure out who's gonna actually fight for him. I think that's way more dramatic than him knowing that Oberyn is gonna stand for him beforehand.
I think Oberyn in general, I think, is stronger in the show,
I think so too.
mostly because of Pascal's performance. But
Yes, and obviously he gets a little more screen time. We get more scenes with him. Yeah, I think that that whole storyline works a little bit better. And again, we talked a little bit before that Storm is a great book, but it's so fastly paced sometimes that I think the pacing is a little messed up. You know what's funny? I think the weakest book is A Clash of Kings.
it is my least favorite.
I can't remember a lot of stuff that happens in that book. Like a lot of it is very forgettable.
It's very transitional
They
between.
set up they set up stuff that's going to be important later, but Danny in Karth all this stuff is you almost kind of don't need it to like it sets up stuff that's going to be important, but you honestly could skip the second book and just go into 3 and it would work.
Yeah, I think there are elements of Clash that are semi essential. I think introducing Stannis is a big thing in his whole camp, and the Blackwater generally is one of my favorite set pieces. But I think that it is overall. It's clear that it wasn't intentional, like Clash as a book, and I think it could have been if Martin like took a little more time with everything, folded into a Game of Thrones. I feel like it could have been one longer text that was what it was initially intended as, and I do think it is the weakest to me. Though I do think a Game of Thrones. I don't know, I go back and forth on it. The writing is, I would say, the most impressive in the series because it is so concise and it is like it is probably the best book in the series. Like to have a beginning, middle, and end. It's a story. But overall, I do think the like shorter chapters. I tend to prefer the longer ones from the series, kind of later on. And you made a good point in terms of like expanding certain characters in the show and certain things the show did better. And I think that does tie into the viewpoint structure as well, because there were so many characters that like we can't see or we can't be in the heads of if our viewpoint characters aren't interacting with them. Like obviously, the example that everyone always talks about is like the Varys and Littlefinger scenes, because obviously neither of those could be a viewpoint character without spoiling everything. But yeah, I think it's a question of mediums at that point.
Yeah, there's different beasts, and the same thing I think is true of House of the Dragon. There's stuff I like about House of the Dragon and stuff I absolutely hate about the way they chose to portray that conflict. And House of the Dragon gets a little bit more leeway because they're not POV books; they're history books that they're based on. So there's contradictory accounts of what happens, and the show has to pick like, okay, we actually have to show what's happening here. I think they lean way too hard on one side, and there's a part of me that hopes they're gonna like subvert that and make these characters the more complicated characters they're supposed to be from the history. I kind of don't feel like they're gonna do that. I think they're gonna keep going down the lane they're going on, and I don't have high hopes for season 3 of House of the Dragon.
I actually do have some hope that they are going to do what you're hoping for and give this more kind of complex version of events, because Rhaenyra is like the main character of House of the Dragon so far. She is, as far as the show is concerned, seemingly near infallible. I think until the second half of season 2, and I think they're doing something pretty interesting there that I don't think many people have touched on much because it hasn't been followed up at all. And season 2 ends in such a weird way where it's like not really an ending and it kind of sucks. But I think this whole like her kind of drinking the Kool-Aid and buying into herself as this prophetic savior figure is really interesting. And I think it's a cool direction for the character that fits in with the books and can kind of compel her into more of a villainous role while still retaining the characterization the show has gotten for her so far. my hopes for season 3 aren't like the highest, but I do still have some hope because I think they are kind of moving more in that direction. I do think that we are seeing maybe a more sympathetic side of the Greens in this upcoming part of the story, given like, Daeron's being introduced, and he's going to be great because everybody loves Daeron. Daeron's one of my favorite characters in the book. And I think that Aegon is going to be kind of more on a sympathetic path because I think after season 2, obviously he was one of the breakout stars of that season, seeing as he was, so injured and coming back from it. And I think it is a compelling arc there that I think they will execute on well. I think that a big part of why season 2 felt so bad and was so bad at points is mostly the lack of ending and just all of these character arcs like kind of dangling at this point in a weird state.
I think so too. I think, like I said, there is a lot I like House of the Dragon. I think that aspect of the fact that the Targaryens had some knowledge of, the Long Night, and that's what they were fighting for to an extent. Like, on some level, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but on
Yeah,
some level, it actually does make a lot of sense, and I could buy that. It kind of sucks a little bit just because we know Game of Thrones is gonna not wrap up this plot line neatly at all. So it's like, what was the point of any of this when that's the ending we got? But that's not really House of the Dragon's fault that Game of Thrones ended that so horribly. But I do agree. I think that's an interesting change. It works with the whole idea that like prophecy can be deceptive, and it's like going to drive people down paths they shouldn't go on just because they think that that's the right thing to do. I like that they made Rhaenyra and Alicent friends. I think that's a
agreed.
very interesting change when they're really not close at all in the books. There's an age gap between them in the books too.
I do think that tends to kind of morph into a weakness at the end of
Oh, for
season 2,
sure.
in that like I don't know, I could buy one of these secret meetings happening at some point.
Multiple is so stupid.
Agreed. And I also think that Alicent, like, effectively signing her children's death warrant is very poor writing on a character that I have previously really liked and really thought the show had improved. And I do think that, I don't know, it's just a change from the Alicent, like season 1 episode 7, when she stabbed Rhaenyra after one of Rhaenyra's kids took Aemon's eye. It doesn't make a ton of sense. It makes sense that she doesn't like a couple of her children because they're kind of becoming monsters, at least in her perspective at this point. But I think it's just a bridge too far for me. But it also has the same problem of being the end point. So maybe she'll pull back on the throttle there, but who
Well,
knows?
again, they do this thing, and that's my biggest problem with House of Dragon. They want the two lead women to be very sympathetic. They want Rhaenyra to be very sympathetic. They want Alicent to be sympathetic, and they kind of can't be for where their story has to go. They need to be kind of ruthless and willing to kill to achieve their goals. I hate the blood and cheese change. I think it's so. This whole
So
like
does George.
Forrest Gumping of like, oh, everything was an accident, and it's like it's really dumb, and it diminishes the story about this family that destroyed themselves because they were so obsessed with power. Again, maybe they will go down that route, but I'm hesitant to embrace it yet till I see the final product. However, one that I'm actually very excited for is A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. I know we've only gotten, a couple of trailers so far, but from what we've seen, it looks really fun. Looks really like they're taking it seriously. The kind of more goofy tone really works for Dunk and Egg. I think it's fine if they want to be a little less serious because that is the books. And there was nothing that from that trailer where I was like, ooh, that looks like, you're not being authentic to the books or anything. It all seemed like a fun, action paced. The only thing that worried me was there going to be enough material for a whole season?
That was my worry at first too.
Yeah, but other than that, and also I a little worry about, okay, if they keep going with Dunk and Egg, they're going to pass the 3 books that George has out here, and then we're going to be in the same problem as Game of Thrones, where it's like, oh, they got to have original material here. That one is going to spoil the books, but 2, will it be as good as what George wrote? So those are my only 2 concerns. But so far, it looks really good.
It does, and I do think I shared both of those concerns, and I think at least the runtime one has mostly been abated in that, like, it's half an hour episodes, which I think
Yeah.
like it could be done well, and I think there are parts of the story that could be expanded in interesting ways. Like, obviously, The interesting thing about this is it was, at least the Hedge Knight was written as the second work of Westeros Martin had ever like written. And in this era of history, things like the Blackfire rebellions are so crucial, but Martin hadn't invented them yet when he wrote the
Yes.
Hedge Knight. So adding in some further history there could be interesting to see. And as for future stories, I am a little worried about that as well, but I am more confident in. Well, we'll see. If this season is good, I am more confident on the ability to, execute new Dunk and Egg stories as opposed to this kind of broader epic saga, because that is kind of all we've seen of Westeros on HBO so far. All of these like operatic, just massive tales, getting to kind of be a bit happier and a bit lighter and a bit smaller. I quite like, and I do think that it's worth noting that Martin at least has what sounds like most of the next Dunk and Egg story written already. He's made reference to, I think it's called The She-Wolves of Winterfell, or at least that was the title at one
I
time.
think it's a working title. I think he's gonna
Yes,
go for like all the books have been describing Dunk in some way. A
that
hedge
was what I was about to
knight,
say. Yeah,
attorney knight, all
unless he's
mystery knight, all
becoming a
this stuff.
She-Wolf of Winterfell,
Yeah, I
I
think
don't think
that's
that
it's a
one.
fun. I like the title. Honestly,
Yeah,
it's a very fun title. But I think he'll go with something describing Dunk in some way. But that'll be cool. And there's a part of me that's like, even if they go past the books, at least we'll get to kind of learn some of the stuff that I don't know George will ever get around to writing. Like he might have the She Wolves of Winterfell done, but will he ever get to like the fire at Summerhall? I don't know if he has the time to with all he has to do for the other two books. So it'll be cool to at least like maybe we'll get that story.
I hope so. And it is. There are my one other worry was very niche, and I thought very funny. Spoilers for like 20 seasons ahead of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. Skip ahead 20 seconds. But Dunk fights Lionel in a trial by combat, Lionel Baratheon, in like 20 years. And Lionel's actor already is like kind of gray hair and everything. And everybody's like talking about he's going to be like ancient by the time they have to fight. But I thought that was funny.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Lionel was the one character who I was like, you don't remind me that much of like I always imagined him as like a Bobby Baratheon type character, like this like really loud, boisterous, muscular drunk guy. He's kind of a little more like a smooth, like jokery type character in this one. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, all the other characters, like all the other casting looks really great. So I'm not gonna hold judgment on that yet. But those first few scenes we had of him, it kind of seemed he was a little bit more low key than the laughing storm in my mind is.
I do think we'll kind of get there. I think there were some shots in the trailer of like him, like very much like dancing and out there drunken at a feast, which I really liked. And I do think he is a character that they could expand in some interesting ways, because he comes into conflict with Dunk some down the line. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the cause for that conflict is him like announcing a rebellion against the crown for some reason. I think
What? It's because
one of the kids broke a
the kids
betrothal.
broke up the marriage. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we won't say which kids, but yeah, no, I think it's interesting because that character has to get to that point, and I think that expanding him now could very much pay off down the line.
People get pissed off at me when I talk about the ending of House of the Dragon, but I always tell them, guys, it's not supposed to be a mystery. It's like
Yeah,
it's known within
Joffrey told us.
Joffrey, yes, literally in the show, and people are like, "Well, I didn't remember that, so stop spoiling it." But this is a story that has like a dramatic irony to it, where we know how it ends, and we're just kind of waiting to see the steps along the way. But you're kind of supposed to go into it knowing that like, oh yeah, one side loses, and again, the Targaryens all die later on too. So it's like it's a history. It's not completely new material.
Exactly, it's a prequel, and in that there's like this layer of dramatic irony because we know more than the characters. We know how it's going to turn out, and I think the best prequels kind of play with that in interesting ways. And I think that House of the Dragon has done some of that. I think there's a lot more room to do that, but we'll see how that gets executed in, I guess, this summer.
We will see. And we're at time here. But I really enjoyed talking about the series with you. I think we share a lot of thoughts in common about the series, and we're obsessed with it. I'd love to have you on again, and maybe we could actually dive in depth on some of the shows, House of the Dragon, Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and maybe we can even talk about the original series, as disappointing as times as it is. But Yeah, I'd love to have you back on sometime and we can go over that stuff.
I'd love to come back. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you guys so much for listening to this, and stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.